everyone out there to know that you can be part of the John Lewis Voting Rights Day of Action. You can join an event in your local neighborhood. You can host an event. We want you all over the country, by the way. We know we got listeners in 45 cities all over the country. Yes, you can do an event, and to those who are international, yes, you can do one too. We are just so determined to make sure that our democracy is strong. So, Christine, thank you. And D.C. statehood, Christine, we must have D.C. statehood, right?
Absolutely. Everyone deserves fair representation, including the nearly 700,000 people that call D.C. home. Wow. And we have no full voting members of Congress, no senators. This is ridiculous. Come on, D.C. We're going to get this done. Thank you so much, Christine. We can't wait to have you back on Igniting Change. Thank you so much, Barbara and Daryl. Looking forward to joining you again next time.
All right. Thank you. And now I want to bring up Attorney Allison Neswood, who is a staff attorney with the mighty, wonderful Native American Rights Fund, North, has been doing all this amazing work in litigation. Every time you're reading about a victory for Native Americans and fighting for voting rights and justice in this country, you're probably going to see Native American Rights Fund mentioned. It is such a joy and a pleasure and an honor for us to have Allison Neswood with us. Hi, Allison.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much. I'm glad to be on the show.
Oh, well, thank you for responding to our late request to come to this show, because we were talking about July 17th and that we're going to all be out there advocating for these bills, but we want to make sure that people know about the Native American Voting Rights Act. Most people have never heard of that, and they have no clue. So can you tell people why this act is so needed, and what would it do when it's passed?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to be able to be on here to do just that. First thing I want to note is that it's on June 2nd, just a couple of days ago, it was the 100-year anniversary of the Indian Citizenship Act, when Congress declared that all Native Americans are citizens of the United States. And one thing I want to lift up about this important anniversary is that, 100 years later, Native Americans are still fighting for fair access to the most fundamental right of citizenship, the right to vote. And I'm, grateful for the opportunity to talk about how the Native American Voting Rights Act, a key piece of federal legislation, would help to achieve the long overdue goal of full enfranchisement for Native people. So first, I'll talk about, the problems that NAVRA, that's the acronym NAVRA, aims to address. In recent elections, turnout among Native Americans has been 16 to more than 20 percentage points lower than for white Americans. In fact, turnout among Natives is typically the lowest compared to any other racial or ethnic group. And at NARF, we know this is the result of it just being too hard for too many Native people to vote, in addition to experiences of discrimination and to the anti-voter laws that the previous speaker spoke about. But if you think about it, voting will generally require identity documents, registration, and then acquiring the correct ballot at election time. And each of these government services typically requires people living on tribal lands or on reservations to travel farther than any other group. So what this looks like is needing to travel, an hour or more just to register in person or just to vote in person. Just completely unreasonable.
If you could. And Allison, if you could, when you say that they need to travel an hour or more, listeners are listening like, why do they need to travel an hour or more? I mean, what is the situation that causes them to have to travel an hour or more if they're living on tribal lands?
Yeah, thank you for the question. The answer is that that where polling locations or in-person registration sites or in-person in-person voting locations, early voting locations are located. They're located, half an hour away from tribal communities right in the middle of the sort of primarily non-native or primarily white town in the county or in the area. And so that's the first reason. The second reason is that Native people are less likely to have access to broadband, internet, and home mail delivery or a post office close by. So things like online voter registration or voting by mail, those things that can, cut down on the travel time for voting are more often not available for people living on tribal lands. And then making those distances more difficult to navigate, tribal communities have little to no public transit infrastructure, and a lot of times, they're living in communities that have a lot of dirt roads that become impassable in bad weather, which, in a lot of our communities is very common in November during voting time.
And is there a special issue that I'm sorry, go ahead, Barbara.
No, go ahead, Daryl.
Is there a special issue that's also presented when it's like the absentee ballots and having the mailbox accessibility for folks that are on tribal lands?
Yes, we were talking about that. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. In a lot of communities, mail voting or absentee voting has been a big help because it cuts out the need to drive to the polls or to get a ride to the polls. But for Native communities where, postal services at the post office are unreliable or at reduced hours, and, people don't have addresses on their homes and don't receive mail delivered to their communities, mail voting can actually have the opposite effect of making voting less accessible if jurisdictions are leaning too heavily into that type of voting.
And, Allison, I've been, when I was at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, of course, we did hearings around the country, and I know there's been some amazing hearings that North has led around the country on these issues. And I know one of the problems that we saw not only was this, the USPS, testifying that they could not deliver mail in time and well. We also saw, a lot of language discrimination. Saw, groups, polling sites that were hostile, to Native Americans. And that's why it's so horrible that, 100 years after the Indian Citizenship Act that we're talking about all of these barriers. So tell our audience what this amazing legislation would do to stop these problems.
Yeah, thank you so much. So the Native American Voting Rights Act is about really changing this legacy of, barrier after barrier after barrier facing the Native voter. And the way that it would do that, the core provisions of NAVRA would focus on bringing sort of robust voter services to tribal lands. And so it would ensure that in each precinct on tribal land, there's an in-person voting location. If the state uses ballot drop box, then there will be a ballot drop box in each precinct on each reservation. And then there will also be the opportunity for what's called a tribal designated building under the Act in each precinct on tribal land. And the tribal designated building is a building that voters in the area could use that building's address as their voting address and also as a place where they could pick up and return a mail ballot. So it really addresses that structural aspect where Native people can't use mail voting. With regard to ballot drop boxes and polling places, there are a lot of provisions in NAVRA that are focused on making sure that those resources are equal to the resources that are off reservation. So making sure that the polling locations on tribal lands have an equal level of staffing and an equal level of resources and equipment for voting, and making sure that they have an equal number of voting hours. A lot of times what we see is election officials will put a polling location on reservation, but only for one day or only for half a day, whereas off reservation they get a full, 7 to even 20 days of voting. So NAVRA says, if they're getting, this much voting time off reservation, then it has to be at the on reservation voting locations as well. So that's the core of NAVRA, is about making sure there's robust voting services in our tribal communities. There are also provisions, important provisions around making sure that tribal ID can be utilized, right alongside a state ID or another form of ID, that a tribal ID will be sufficient in order to register or to vote if there are ID requirements in the state. There's also provision that ensures, one way that tribal communities deal with these long distances to the polls is, Native-led civic engagement groups or just community leaders will go around and collect ballots for the seniors in the community, or for people with disabilities, or for people who have to work, and they'll return those ballots for them, that ballot collection process. And so NAVRA would make sure that ballot collection effort is allowed on tribal lands. And then, there are specific provisions around implementation, making sure that tribes have a role in, determining or have the say in determining where these voting resources are located, because, they know their communities. And then there's enforcement provisions, which make sure that, tribes and that Native American individuals can bring cases to enforce NAVRA's provisions alongside the Department of Justice.
Wow.
That's really interesting. And if I may, Barbara, Allison, one of the things that I've also found interesting, in addition to NAVRA, is that it appears as though some states, like New Mexico, where they're voting today, they're having their primary day, have sort of enacted, I guess you would call it a local NAVRA provision, so that the state actually imposes its own statute, which is adopting the principles of NAVRA. And one of the side effects of that, of course, is that they allow, like, the tribal offices to be used as the street addresses for some of the people that have difficulty, as you were discussing, making it to polling places. Have you seen any impact of the state-oriented NAVRA legislation that's been put in place? Has that made a difference?
One example of sort of state policy really making a big difference can be seen in Colorado, where what they did was make sure that each reservation had a vote center, and vote center is a place where people can pick up and drop off a mail ballot, where people could register to vote, where people could basically do all of their voting needs at one time. And that, from the time that they went from the election where those weren't implemented to the election where they were, they saw enormous increases on both reservations in Colorado in terms of turnout. I think, in the double-digit increases in turnout for the election after that policy was implemented. And yes, I'm really glad that you pointed out how, state actors can have a big influence in terms of incorporating the principles of NAVRA, which are focused on bringing voting infrastructure to tribal communities. Because it's not that Native people don't care about these elections. We understand that they have enormous impact on our communities, on our rights as Native people, and if voting is accessible, Native people will show up and will make their voices heard, and that voice is just so critical.
Outstanding. Can you tell people how they can get where they can get more information on the NAVRA, and also tell people how they can be in touch with you? Because I know there are people are just scrambling, saying, "Oh, we need her to come and speak to our groups, to our networks." Please tell people how they can get the more information about NAVRA, and how they can get in touch with you.
Absolutely. They can go to vote.narf.org. So it's vote.narf.org. And there's a tab there for our congressional work, and we have a lot of information there around NAVRA, around our various testimony on the legislation, as well as one-pagers and sort of brief overviews of the legislation. In terms of getting in contact with me, I love to talk to folks about NAVRA and just about getting involved in the political process and making their voices heard. So definitely reach out. My email is neswood@narf.org. I'm happy to talk with anyone.
You are amazing. Thank you so much for being on our show. We know that you have a hard stop, but we want you to know that we can't wait to have you back, because this is going to be a drumbeat of our show until we get this bill passed. We really want to thank you. Amazing information. I know we've all learned a lot